So everybody, welcome back to the Think Tank Happy Hour on Thursdays. We've missed you all. This should be a lot of fun. Glad we're doing this today and glad that Fernando could join us. We're trying to bring some insights here and there, but more importantly, we're going to try and have some fun as well. For those who are curious, the drinking word is demand. And, you know, at the end of the day, I think, in my view at least, energy is at the core of so many themes, economic themes, you know, quite honestly, structure matters themes. You know, it's a life-altering experience when your gas, when you're filling up your car is $5, right? So I think it's so interrelated. So I was thrilled that Fernando would join us. So Fernando, just so you know, we're going to go around our panel group, David and Cynthia, and everybody gets a chance to introduce themselves. And I'll start by just reminding everybody who I am as the lead ETF strategist for the ETF Think Tank, and of course the portfolio manager with Mike Venuto of Block, also on the investment committee at Toroso. So thanks everybody. I guess, Dave, I'm going to punt to you at this point, and you can give your background.
Thank you, Professor. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for continuously signing in. Dave Chikansky, portfolio manager here with Toroso. I focus on the SoFi Gig Economy ETF, as well as the Amplify Inflation Fighting ETF, which is very relevant in today's world, in today's conversation. So I will pass it on to Cynthia.
Hey guys, we've missed you all. We're glad to be back and get together with everybody. I'm the head of research for the tank, as you know, and I'm thrilled that we have today Fernando Valle here. He is a countryman from Brazil, so I'm very excited. We got to brush up on our Portuguese right before this call. And if all else fail, if we're done with oil, we can talk about Carnival, Brazilian food, whatever else you guys have in mind. So Fernando, would you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do at Bloomberg and
Absolutely.
all that stuff?
And Flamengo as well, which won yesterday.
No. If we get into soccer, then our friendship may be jeopardized.
Well, thank you, Cynthia, Dan, and Dave. My name is Fernando Valle. I'm a senior energy analyst with Bloomberg Intelligence. I've covered everything oil and gas for 13 years now. Started it covering just Latin America, but since progressed to covering the majors, the refiners, and the commodity itself. Prior to Bloomberg, I was at Citigroup for 7 years. And in my prior life in finance, I financed aircraft, which was a very interesting thing in the 2007-2008 period. So happy to talk macro, happy to talk about big oil, refiners. I cover pretty much everything that's a large cap in the Americas. So happy to Exxon, Suncor, Petrobras, all of those are within my purview.
Well, I'll kick it off with the first question here. So are these big guys finally investing in more projects?
Yeah.
Regardless of where are there, and what's the timeline of that look like?
Yeah, they've been investing. In fact, Exxon raised their capex, and this is as of already said as of last year, by over $10 billion on an annual basis. Exxon is the largest of the big guys investing in the upstream, which is the oil and gas production side of the equation. They have 3 pillars of growth right now: the Permian in West Texas and New Mexico, my native Brazil and the pre-salt, and then Guyana, which is an emerging frontier, huge resources just starting to get tapped in. And then you look at ConocoPhillips, for example, another large player who's only gotten larger. They made big acquisitions during the pandemic. They bought Concho Resources, which was a big Permian player. They bought Shell's Permian acreage. And today they announced a big partnership with Sempra Energy, where my old boss works, to develop an LNG facility in Texas. So they are making significant investments, but there are several issues why we haven't seen the kind of production growth that was once expected and hoped for. One is bottlenecks. Everyone's having a hard time hiring, and oil isn't any different. They're having a hard time, especially at one point with trucking and drivers. That's kind of eased off now. Second, equipment, and third, materials. We all saw the inflation in steel at one point, sand, all of that has filtered through and kind of held back. But we are seeing growth. We're at 12.1 million barrels a day now. And last year we were at 11. So that's significant growth. Just taking some time. I think we'll probably get back to our peak of 13.3 by around 2025, which is still pretty impressive growth if you think about it.
And lastly, when you see like all of these names with oil holding up, joining the broader market sell-off, what is your thought? Is that like a reset in expectations because prices stopped rising? Is that in response to geopolitical events? Like you have tacticians out there who will say, the top quintile bucket is shaking out with the rest of the market. Maybe that means a bottom is forming. What is the viewpoint from an energy analyst perspective when you see those shakeouts in unison with everything else?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think personally, there are two parts to it. One is they don't think that the current price levels are sustainable. And two, there's a fear, and I read this all over Twitter from the generalist side, that the energy transition will decimate these stocks. And I think there's a quintessential misunderstanding about how demand will play out in an energy transition.
Oh, yeah. Cynthia.
I had to break that in just so we could get our break our duck.
Please, that was smooth. Thank you.
There's just a misunderstanding. I think what this war has done is highlighted how oil and gas demand is not just simply going to fall off a cliff. It will be a transition, as the name says, and it'll be gradual. And I think it will be a lot longer than most people were expecting a couple of years ago. Again, Cynthia can back me up, but in Brazil, we go through blackouts and brownouts every 5 to 10 years. And to think that an average Brazilian will be able to afford a $40,000 Tesla and to charge it is ludicrous. The most common car in India costs $4,000, and it's very fuel efficient because it's so small. We have to think that most of the growth in oil demand over the past 15 years have come from emerging markets. When we look at the OECD, essentially the developed markets, it's been flat to slightly down.
Yeah, if I may just jump in, we were just dropping off my daughter in London a couple of weeks ago. She's going to college there. And so we took a bunch of the cabbies there. And to that point, they are obligated now to buy only electrical vehicles. If you're a cab driver in England, they cost 70,000 pounds. So they're expensive. And the technology isn't quite there yet. They only get maybe 100 miles on a battery. So these guys have to figure out a way to just drive that much and then be able to charge it. It's totally messed up some of their schedules. Some are doing the hybrid thing and first gas and then the electrical and then go back to gas to go home. And so I think the idea that this is going to take time is a great point that we tend to overlook.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you get $4,000 a megawatt in Texas right now.
Now you just confused me as far as where my questions begin and end. So, and I definitely want to come to that. What is your expectation for the price of energy, gas, and heating energy as well?
Well, I think it's important to differentiate oil and gas, and because gas is inherently a regional commodity because it's very expensive to move it across oceans. So speaking of oil, because that's a more global commodity, my view is that we're going to go through a period of weakness in the short term because inflation has become such a major target for all the central banks, especially the Fed. You know, the 9.1 print really should light a fire under Jerome Powell to go raise rates. And if we get 1%, that will have an impact on demand, right? We'll have fewer investments. We might have higher unemployment. All of those will impact global demand. We're already seeing some of the signs of breakdown in emerging markets, especially under their demand. And with the dollar up to, you know, Dixie's at 109, euro and parity, a lot of those countries will have a balance of payments issue. That all will lower oil demand. However, the supply side is not fixed, and it won't be fixed for several years. So I think that any short-term weakness that brings us to, you know, to the 80s, 70s, maybe even the 60s would be a moment that wouldn't last long. You know, I kind of see parallels, not to the whole macro, but because it was a different setup, but in oil to the 2008 period, because we went through such significant underinvestment in the industry since 2014. And that's not going to be fixed overnight. Saudi Arabia is making some investments, the UAE is making some investments. Obviously, US shale production is growing, but we won't see the results of that until 2025. And that growth will help offset some of the decline. Remember, oil well, its production will peak on day one, and from there on it will decline. So we have to overcome not just demand growth, but also the decline of all the reservoirs in the world. And so I think we'll settle out in the $100 to $120 a barrel over the 2 to 3 year period, because we need to go through another wave of investments, especially on the exploration front, and that will take some time to play out.
I guess I'm confused. We spoke about this a little bit before the call, but I was questioning the actual impact that raising interest rates would have on oil prices, because it's lack of effect on supply. And really the question is how elastic or inelastic the demand really is. And outside of the United States and in emerging markets, and from a corporate perspective, that might fluctuate. But am I wrong that on day-to-day life for a lot of the developed world, a lot of this is just inelastic? You can cut down your use a little bit, but the majority of it is travel for work, travel for food, for services, especially if you're outside of the city, right? You're just in your house. You can't necessarily get everything Amazon to you. You actually do have to leave. So is there a lag? Is it just as easy as interest rates is a destruction of GDP, which will cause a lag of demand in 18 months? And is that why you more predict a short-term spike here?
Absolutely, on the demand elasticity being much more in EM than developed markets. That's still significant because EM is now over 55% of global oil demand. And then the second part to your question is, we are coming from so oil really reflects two things, which is the expectations of the market, which I can go into it, but I think are the biggest short-term driver, and then the rate of change in inventories. And our inventories are already very low. So we are not going to get a rebuild right away. And I think, but if we cut demand very significantly from EM, we will start seeing that rate of change collapse. And then I would say on the second part of your question, as far as the effect on GDP and whether there's a lag, yes, there's a lag. It depends, but 12 to 18 months, because if you think about the use of diesel, for example, diesel is used for all of our agriculture, all of our heavy transportation. So yes, we're still going to need to go to work, although there's been changes there too. We can now work remotely much more easily, but we can order less from Amazon, and we're seeing that with retail. Volumes are down, even though revenues are relatively stable. We can have fewer housing starts. Housing is a huge part of the oil demand market. We can have less construction, big on diesel, and we can have less cement. Again, takes a lot of energy to produce. And so all of those will have repercussions. So fewer investments have an outsized impact, especially on the diesel side and ultimately on demand. And if we look at 2008 again as an example, we saw a 4 million barrel a day drop, which is pretty significant.
Got to figure out where that's coming from. Oh, it's Mark Monin.
That's Jason.
Jason.
And Jason. Okay, I'll mute him too. Okay, cool. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay, so for me, key subject, of course, is Texas. Please, answer my prayers and bring the problem to a rest. And for those who don't know, I care because a lot of the miners that were along in block are in Texas, and I definitely feel as if Texas is trying to solve some of the problem, the grid problem, through a lot of innovation technically, and they need to, because they have heat waves, right? So they need to build out their grid, and I think that Fernando, you'll agree with this, I hope, that Bitcoin miners are probably part of the solution in the case of Texas specifically.
Well, I mean, they certainly have helped by reducing their demand and helping ease some of the pressure on the grid. I was just reading a statistic that Texas, since over the past 20 years, population has grown about 1.6% per annum, which is pretty significant. Especially when you consider that the U.S. population is relatively flat. The issue is really that the grid in Texas is not built for redundancy, so not about reliability. There aren't a lot of peakers. It's really about balancing, and there isn't a lot of interconnection. So whenever you have over demand that's over and above their baseline, they risk the failure in parts of the grid. So what do? They try to limit the overall consumption so they can keep the grid balanced. So I think, as you said, this is a temporary issue. It's a temporary but recurring issue, I would say. We'll have those issues as long as we have big heat waves, and in the winter we'll have those issues as we have more and more problems with weather, unless they weatherize the systems. So I think you'll be okay. It's a temporary issue. Eventually you will ease off, but I think overall the cost of electricity is going to rise in the US and especially in Europe. And I see there are a couple of questions on the chat, and I'll kind of jump into them because they kind of dovetail. One is, if European refineries source the nitrogen they need, how will I mean, nitrogen, you typically do a process out of methane. So it would be an issue with natural gas. I mean, European refineries are having so many issues with just running their capacity and sourcing the crude. I think that's one of the big issues we see in the East Coast, where I am today, that we import a lot of gasoline and at times diesel into the East Coast from Europe. And I just see them having a significant problem of being able to run their refineries effectively with power prices as high as they are. And there the problem isn't going away, Dan. So if you have any miners in Europe, that's not the best place to have them. So I think it'll have an issue, and that will reverberate into East Coast prices, which is why I think especially diesel will be expensive for a while in the East Coast, and especially if Russia cuts off natural gas to Europe in the winter. It really has the potential to be a catastrophe mostly to the Europeans, but even in parts of New England that rely on diesel for heating and power generation. The other question was about light crude in the US. Is the US able to refine all the light sweet we produce, or do we have to export and import heavy crude? So currently, funnily enough, we are exporting both. We are exporting our light sweet crude because, as Michael Maglio said, we have too much light crude, which produces an abundance of gasoline, and so we have to export that. But we're also exporting Canadian heavy because the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, it's mostly medium sour crudes, which are being released, about 1 million barrels a day. And that's pushing out some of that Canadian. We import close to 3.5 to 4 million barrels a day of Canadian heavy. And that Canadian heavy is getting pushed out in favor of that SPR release. Of course, they taper off in October, so that will bring about a change. But in the short term, we're exporting both. In the long term, I think that we're going to increase our light crude capabilities. Exxon and Valero are both investing in topping units that will process more US shale. And I think that has its own repercussions on having gasoline being overproduced in order to get more diesel, which is something we're really in dire need of.
So you said gasoline. I just want to ask, so at the pump, what are we looking towards? I mean, Mark Mona was saying California is like $7. That's scary, yeah. Right? I'm fearful at 5. Can we see some help there?
And on that, I'll add to that question, ask just because it's relevant. You're seeing states respond with like giving out checks for oil, which just doesn't seem to change demand all that much, which is why your prior demand destruction comments via interest rates surprise me. So I'll add that as well.
Yeah, well, to address the easy part, definitely giving checks doesn't help the supply destruction, but the supply issues. As you said, it's actually something that emerging markets do a lot of, subsidizing fuel prices because they're a much bigger burden on their consumers. But eventually it runs out, right? And we're seeing that. I mean, Argentina is again on the brink of a default, and their inflation is going through the roof, and they subsidize fuel prices. So that's how it happens, right? Like it's, you subsidize it but you create deadweight loss and you create a burden on the state, and you don't foster the investments that would be needed in order to address the supply issues. So you're just really putting a Band-Aid on a very deep gash. We are going to see some relief for a couple of different reasons. One, we saw a big drop in demand. It was largely due to the holiday, because usually there's some preemption during the holiday on the last CIA number released on Wednesday. We're going to see a recovery. That's just, as obvious as it usually is because of the holiday impact, but we haven't seen demand approach 2019 levels yet. And we don't think we will. And this is really where we should be starting to see much higher demand for gasoline. And then to build on what I said earlier, so every barrel of oil, when you process it, they have an inherent yield of light products, which are primarily gasoline and naphtha, but let's call it gasoline, and then middle products, which are diesel and jet fuel, and then bottom products, which are asphalt, fuel oil, and the like. When you look at the inventory levels in the US, which is the most transparent market, we're about on the 10-year average for gasoline. We're well below the 10-year average for diesel and jet. Globally, we have a bit more than the average on gasoline, especially with China and Singapore products. So there's actually plenty of supply on gasoline. But when I'm trying to get diesel, which is about 30% of the barrel, I wind up producing gasoline, which is 50% of the barrel. So what we think is today, the margin on gasoline, which we call the crack spread, is around $44 a barrel. So that's pretty significant. Even though oil is 100, your barrel of gasoline is 145. We think this will probably drop into the 20s. Very significant again. Are we going back to under $3, $2? No. But we can probably get to a 3 handle if oil stays around this level or drops into the 90s sometime in the second half. Now, diesel, on the other hand, is a much bigger issue. Diesel crack spreads are over $55 a barrel. We don't have a solution. And as to Michael's earlier question, we have a lot of light oil. When we process light oil, we have more gasoline than we have diesel. And then on top of that, you have Europe. And Europe imports the equivalent of 2.2 million barrels a day of natural gas from Russia. If that gets cut off, it has to be made up with diesel and fuel oil, or just demand destruction. We export about 1.1 million barrels a day from the US, net, because there's a transportation issue that happens. We export around 920,000 barrels a day of diesel. That's not, nearly enough to satisfy Europe. And obviously that would mean we're not sending that to other places, namely Latin America. So the price will only rise if we get cut off. And that supply was natural gas, which again, as I said earlier, regional commodity, it won't go anywhere else. It's temporarily lost. So we are increasing oil demand for diesel of a product that we don't have. So we think we're going to get a lot of gasoline, but no relief on diesel. And that will be painful, especially for industrial uses and heavy transportation.
Makes total sense. Diesel is the toilet paper of COVID, right? So.
Except you use it for everything.
Yes. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about, unless there's some more questions on this, I wanted to, and I know this is not your direct focus, but the other commodity in question globally is on the agricultural side. If you want to maybe frame your outlook on the marketplace on that side, sure. We can jump into that a little bit.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an interesting issue there with Russia and Belarus being huge producers of grain, but also potash. That's very important in the fertilizer world. And then Ukraine also being an important supplier of wheat. That in itself could, it's damned if you stay, damned if you don't. But we would lose those harvests. So that would actually decrease your demand for diesel, but at the same time, at the expense of losing a huge source of grains. And it's not that you and I are going to go without our daily bread, but again, emerging markets, much more vulnerable communities will see a huge increase in their cost of food. There will obviously be, unfortunately, some issues feeding those people, and their economies will have, again, they'll be subsidized, and rightfully so, but that will come at a significant cost to the country themselves, especially those countries that aren't able to feed themselves, either because of land mass or whatever, and then I think there's a question later on, again, as we transition, of how do we equate those costs in the US, for example. In North America, I should say, there's been a huge emphasis on renewable fuels that use seed oils as an input. And that will be, I think that will come into focus over the next year or two, because it's already having an impact on cost inflation. Corn, palm oil, soybeans, and can be used for ethanol or for renewable diesel production. And that's leading to inflation for farmers and for restaurants. And I think we'll have to revisit those policies. And again, the transition framework that we're using today for biofuels, because you don't want to put in a time where people are struggling with starvation. You don't want to put a gallon of soybean or palm oil into your tank. You want to put it on people's tables.
I'm going to the questions at this point.
Yeah, why don't we bring up Michael, who he's been posting several questions throughout the show. Michael Maglio, bring up and he can ask the questions himself.
Sure, good idea. I just got to figure out how to do it, of course. Let's see. Well, while I do that, actually, let me ask the question that Lily Poi has asked. She actually asked two questions. Can you talk about investing in upstream, midstream, and downstream? And then she has a second question, and it's definitely two parts. Do you cover Canadian oil and gas companies, which I know you do? So maybe break apart the two questions and answer them both while I get to while I open it up to Michael's questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so upstream, the oil and gas producers, they're the most directly correlated to oil price and gas price itself. I think when you look at the US, there is a huge gamut of players and options, from the integrated companies that I cover, ExxonMobil, Chevron. I cover Conoco, which is not really an integrated, but a major, to the pure plays like your Pioneers, small caps like Matador. I think if you're not looking at the blue chip names, the really big companies, it's really around management of capital and the alignment between management and minority shareholders. So the things I look for are the compensation agreements, that they're based on returns and not growth. That was a huge issue that in the 2014 period that was revisited. Another thing that's important in my view is the acreage itself. One of the issues, and it actually dovetails into one of the questions, is the issues with overall US production. If you look at some of the key oil fields in the US, for example, the Bakken in North Dakota, we over drilled it very fast because a lot of managements, their incentives were to grow production as fast as they could. That's how their compensation packages were structured. And today, I think it would be very hard for us to see the Bakken reach its peak of 1.5 million barrels a day. Today it's closer to 1.1, maybe getting to 1.2 million barrels a day. We just don't have the inventory. Oil and gas, for that matter, are under pressure in their reservoirs. And once you drill, you're releasing that pressure. And so you have the number one job of an oil engineer is to manage that reservoir pressure, so you get as much oil for as low a cost as you can out of the ground. And I think we didn't do a great job of that in the Bakken, for example. Midstream is a very different beast altogether. It's around contracts and separate. In midstream, you have the pipelines, and there are a variety of different types of pipelines, long haul, like your Enbridges and TC Energies from Canada, but that operate in the US, to your smaller, your local players like your Targa Resources and the like. And then there's gathering and processing. That part tends to be a little bit more volatile because that correlates a lot more with the level of activity in their direct acreage. So usually their contracts are structured that they process whatever is produced within a radius of acreage. And if the production there is declining, you won't get volumes. And they do have some short-term protections because typically those contracts are structured in what's called a take or pay. So there's a minimum level, and then anything above that, they make more, and that tends to be pure margin, and that's when they are at their best. And then refining, which is my bread and butter, really, they're pass-throughs. They make that crack spread, that margin. on the barrel. And then they also make the difference between crudes, because a crack spread is usually calculated versus Brent, which is the global benchmark, or WTI, which is our US benchmark. But you never run Brent and WTI through your system, very rarely. You run a different crude. You run Bakken Clearbrook, you run Syncrude, you run WCS, whatever it is. You run a blend of those. So crude differentials are critical. And then the crack spreads and the renewable fuel standards is critical. I think today, when I look at ExxonMobil's second quarter guidance, the refining side was well above consensus. Consensus on the Bloomberg terminal showed $2.5 billion of net earnings from refining in the second quarter, and Exxon guided to 5.2 to 5.9. So what that tells me is that the refiners are going to surprise a lot of people in the second quarter. And that's, I mean, it really shouldn't, because crack spreads are at a 40-year high. So, but it is surprising sometimes how fast refiners can make and lose money. So it's a very volatile industry. You really need to understand locations and the dynamics of the fuels, which is talked about here on gasoline and diesel. And then lastly, I do cover Canadian oil sands. I cover Suncor, Cenovus, and Imperial. They're cash flow machines with very limited growth. They're very unique things, again, very cyclical. I think I can talk about the differentials, for example, the Western Canadian Select, Canadian heavy crude, the differentials have widened. Part of that is because we are re-exporting that crude. So crude is always priced on your last barrel out. And if your last barrel out is having to go out of Edmonton, Canada, through Corpus Christi and into a seaborne market, all that cost winds up being reflected in how much money you're making. With that said, I think they are making a tremendous amount of money. They really don't have anywhere to spend it other than paying it back to shareholders until the second half of the decade. And that's if the policy is constructive enough for them to warrant investing. Canada has one of the largest oil resources in the world, in the oil sands. We know exactly where they are. It's not hard to find it as opposed to exploration. It is costly, and the biggest issue to Canada has been building enough capacity to export it out of Alberta. If you can solve that, then there is plenty of growth to be had, but probably at around a $65 to $75 a barrel break even.
So, wow. I got to just say that lots of demand there. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So Mike Maglio, can you ask a question? I think you're open, you're unmuted. You've just been very patiently quiet.
Yes, it does say
great.
I'm unmuted, so hopefully you can hear me.
Thank you. We can hear you great.
Okay. Yeah, the video, I don't even have that option. Doesn't show me that.
Sorry about that.
No problem. All right. So a couple of questions. I already wrote a couple of them in there, but I have a couple more as well. So what's the biggest problem or the roadblock or red tape that's stopping us from getting back to lower gas prices when we were basically had about half or less than what we're currently paying right now?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are a couple. One is enough oil production, and that just is going to take time. And the second one, there's a bit of on the bureaucracy side, especially on gasoline. The East Coast imports around 700 to 800,000 barrels a day of gasoline, primarily from Europe. There's a very old law, over 100 years old, called the Jones Act. You may have heard it when Puerto Rico was hit with Hurricane Maria, and et cetera. But essentially what it does is that you can't transport anything between US ports with a foreign vessel. So a vessel to be used has to be built in the US, manned by US citizens, flagged in the US. And there are very few of those that transport oil. So it's cheaper for us to bring gasoline, diesel, and crude from abroad than it is to bring from the Gulf Coast. So we wound up exporting more. It's almost evenly matched. What we export from the Gulf Coast to what the East Coast imports. So the costs there tend to be significantly higher, and there's what it's known as the cost arbitrage. But because you could theoretically export it, you are always going to price within the transportation cost of bringing that product to the highest cost market. So that's one of the big barriers. And then as I said, the oil production side, because we've been declining, it's more in the US. It's a global issue. Oil is a global commodity. It is fungible with transportation costs. And again, I think the biggest thing that can be done is investments and recognition that a transition will be gradual and can't just be forced upon us without an impact on energy. I call it energy sufficiency and energy development. I think we need to understand that energy is critical to the development of the world and to our well-being. The biggest gains in humanity have happened after we've been able to harness external energy. And if you look at any developed country, their consumption has grown exponentially as they developed.
Wow. So I'm going to continue with some of the questions. And of course, Eric Connolly asks, how will European refineries source the nitrogen? Because he's always going for those specific questions.
Yeah.
They need for desulfurization diesel.
Right. So hydrotreating. We were talking a bit about that. I mean, you produce nitrogen and hydrogen by cracking methane, and they won't. At the end of the day, they won't be cost competitive as it stands with Russian Urals being cut. They won't be competitive with power prices going the way that they're going. They won't be competitive because natural gas will weigh on their ability to create those processes, from hydrotreating to desulfurization and et cetera. So I think at the end of the day, Europe was already behind the 8 ball in refining because of their ESG policies, and this will make it very difficult for a lot of the European refineries. I'm looking a lot at the Italian ones that are older, older technology, sourced a lot from Russia. They are going to struggle mightily to produce. And that's, again, one of the reasons why we're afraid about the prices in the East Coast, because we import a lot into the East Coast.
So Ray, let me just ask Ray's questions, David, before you go into it. Sorry. Ray asks, regarding Russia's oil output, what is your opinion of permanent reductions of their production as a result of sanctions that could cause interruption in their northern fields that may be difficult to restart once sanctions are lifted? I think he's optimistic. We're never lifting them again.
Ray, I'm going to say that is the place where I've gotten, I was proven wrong the worst on my predictions after the Ukraine invasion, because I would have expected that Russian production would have started to fall at the 500 to 600,000 barrels a day pace by now, and they haven't. I still think they will drop because, as you said, there are several issues. One is the access to capital. Oil is very capital intensive, and so it's fighting a war. The other one is services. The Western companies provided only a fraction of the oil services in Russia, but they were all the more challenging wells, and that were having growth and also had need that expertise. So that growth is gone. And third, because of the sanctions, and even though you're still selling to India, Pakistan, the Middle East, they aren't getting as high revenues as the oil price would imply. The logistics are much more difficult. They get a discount, so their revenues are hit very significantly. And then I'll say, there was a theory that because Europe is curtailing natural gas and Russia has threatened to cut natural gas, that would force them to shut in some of their northern fields, and that would cause issues. The thing is, Russia has a lot of dry gas fields. Dry gas means you produce purely methane, maybe a little bit of methane and propane in it, but mostly methane. And you can shut those pretty easily. If you think about how an oil and gas well produces, you recover about 15 to 30% of the volume in place for an oil well, but for a gas well, that's closer to 96%, at least 90%. Methane is a very light molecule that will flow easily. And so when you do that, it's if you shut in a natural gas well, you don't have as many issues with pressure as you would for an oil well. So I think I still think it will decline. It hasn't been as fast or as pronounced as I would have expected. If Iran and Venezuela are any indication, it will take a really long time to recover because your infrastructure suffers. And not all of them, but a fair amount of Russia's production is high sulfur. And that's very difficult to maintain. Just ask Venezuela again. And so they need the capital. I think there will be well under 10 million barrels a day at this time of next year.
Hey, Ray Scheimer, do you have a follow-up question or correction on how I asked the question?
No, answer no follow-up. Just I think if was a better statement there than when. I don't have any specific. They're going to stop those sanctions anytime soon.
Fair enough.
And just so you know, Chris Dry is calling in from Canada. So we definitely have a diverse group. Listen, it's 5:50. I promised Cynthia I'd keep it to 50 minutes. Do we have any other random questions? Cynthia, you have a follow-up question or thought?
Yeah, maybe we can wrap up, Fernando, before thanking you so much for there's so much information. I'm still processing it, but as we look now, second half of the year, is Russia the biggest risk to all the oil energy outlooks right now, or is there something that's kind of underrated or overlooked that could really set fire to things in a way that we don't see coming?
Well, I think on the downside is first I should say thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. And also, if you don't follow me on Twitter, I'm at Fernando Oil. Just a little plug.
Good job. Good job.
But just to answer your question, I think to the downside, I wrote in the beginning of the year that the Fed was the biggest risk to oil prices. And I still think that. And I think that a 1% hike so a lot of the decline, and this goes to David's earlier question, but a lot of the decline over the past couple of weeks, we've seen financial positions, financial derivatives in oil, diesel, and gasoline being sold at the fastest pace since March of 2020. April, I should say, sorry. That because of recession fears. As I said, you can give some subsidies for some time, but at the end of the day, you can't keep it going forever. So to me, on the downside, that is the biggest risk. The upside, it's an escalation. And I think that, and this is me trying to find, as we say in Portuguese, trying to hit the fly's butt with a dart. But it's me trying to pinpoint too much, but I think the winter is really when the upside risks are going to play out, because it's a game of chicken. Will they cut off Europe? And if they do, 2.2 million barrels a day of diesel and fuel oil aren't just readily available. Like I said, we are below the 10-year average on diesel by a long shot. We can't just make that up. And it will be mission critical to Europe and European leaders to find an insurance policy before winter. And if they don't, then prices can really explode.
Mhm.
And that to me is the biggest risk.
I mean, you
Um,
say if they don't, is there any way they can? Like, what is this? What is the outlook where they do? I mean, is there one?
Well, I think there are a couple of things they can do. One is start working now to reactivate any shuttered capacity. Probably it's too late, but I would also try to fill. They're currently filling their natural gas inventories as fast as they can. We are around 80% at this time of the year. Last year, we were only at 60. But that won't be enough if there is a cold spell. Last year wasn't even that bad of a winter, and still European power prices went through the roof. I mean, NBP and TTH, NBP, National Balancing Point in the UK, TTH in Rotterdam, they went parabolic. And that wasn't even a very cold winter, and we had Russian supply. Imagine if it's a cold winter, or if you don't have Russian supply. I would start stockpiling diesel right now. Again, but the issue is, whereas diesel's crack spreads are through the roof, where are you going to get it? And you know, they'll hate it, but you have to stockpile fuel oil. Fuel oil is the dirtiest, least expensive option, but I would go stockpile it. I mean, it's better than freezing.
So last question, do you have like a bunker full of oil somewhere? You're just like stockpiling this.
So he has a house on the beach where it's never cold.
No, I'm in Long Island. I do have a variety of supply because my heat runs on natural gas, but I can always get an electric heater. So and then I can get a fireplace going with wood, worst case scenario.
Well, it's not like timber doesn't go up in price too, my friend. Ask Guy. He's omnipresent. He has definitely a view.
The last option is my mother-in-law is in Florida and my parents are in Rio, so I'll flee.
Oh God. Wow. I like that as an answer. Go to mommy. So thank you so much for your participation, and everybody should follow you. That I think they'll get good insights. I'm definitely going to follow you more assertively and retweet you even too. Listen, guys, this has been a lot of fun. We toasted a lot with demand, and I don't remember, Cynthia, do we have somebody else coming up next week? Or
we're confirming in the next couple of days, so we'll let you guys know.
Super cool. Thanks for all your wonderful questions, everybody. Be safe. That's first and foremost, and be healthy and avoid COVID, because gosh, it seems like it's getting everybody.
Yep. Thanks, guys. Thanks again, Fernando.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Fernando. Be well.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.